Welcome to episode 2 of Bible 180. 180 episodes through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, about 10 or so minutes at a time, looking through the storyline of the Bible. The greatest story ever told, looking at God's story, God's action, our reaction, God's relentless pursuit to get us back from a life and a world of sin into the relationship with God that God wanted from the beginning. I'm Eric Burtness. I've been a pastor for over 40 years. I've loved teaching and preaching and studying the Bible and wanted to share this overview in 180 episodes with you. In the first episode, we talked about those two Bible verses that were important. When Jesus says, repent, he didn't mean, as his first words, feel bad about the things you've done. Rather, change your mind, change your way of thinking. And then Romans 12:1, where Paul writes, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed. How do you get transformed? Paul says, by the renewing of your mind, so that you might know what the will of God is, what is good and acceptable and perfect. We'll be talking over the next number of episodes about the trilogy of head, heart, and hands. The way that you think, the way that you feel, the way that you act, your conviction, your character, your conduct, all of which result in the lifestyle, the destiny that you lead and live into. Head, heart, and hands, lifestyle, convictions, character, conduct, lifestyle. So all of those are combined together, and an important part of how we renew our minds, what we think about, in order to change the way we feel and the way we act, resultant in a lifestyle that is pleasing to God. I encourage you in the first episode to get up in the morning and just say to yourself, it's going to be a great day. I hope you did that. And as you end the day, just look back and think about a couple of things for which you were thankful, for gratitude, of an attitude of gratitude. That will be an important part of working through these episodes. And again, we'll return to those a number of times. Now, let's think about an overview of the book of Genesis. What's in there? One of the things I think you'll discover as we work our way through these episodes is you'll think, oh yeah, I knew that story. I know that story, but I don't really understand how it ties in to the whole flow of the story of the Bible. So kind of putting a string of pearls on a necklace so that you see the whole flow of things is very important, and where things go in the grand story of the Bible will make sense over the next number of episodes, especially through the Old Testament. I know that story of Hezekiah, but how does Hezekiah relate to King Elimelech or whatever it might be? You know, how do these stories fit in? That will be, I hope, unfolded for you over these episodes. Now, the Bible starts in Genesis 1 with one creation account, a very orderly, God said, and it was so. Genesis 2 has another creation account, which begins with the creation of a man, Adam, or Hadamah is a name. Hadam, we'll talk about that in the next couple of episodes. When God created the heavens and the earth in Genesis 1, and then God created the man, a garden, and then finally a woman after all of the animals that God brought to the man weren't enough for his company or to make him fulfilled. There's two different orders of creation, and we'll talk about God's original intent in both of those stories, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. God's purpose for creation, the principles and the doctrines of that God wished to instill in the world that God created. That's Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 3, the story of the Garden of Eden, is how we really messed it up. God gave us this perfect world, this amazing place in which to live and caretake and all of that. God said, just don't do this one little thing. And of course they did it. You know, the same thing with kids. You know, say, Don't play with that toy. Well, of course, that's the first one they go to. So we'll look at understanding that more when we get to Genesis 3. Even so, at the end of Genesis 3, God gives a curse and a blessing at the same time as God moves them out of the garden. Genesis 4 sees the real result of that sin. Cain and Abel, the fratricide, one killing the other. The effect of our sin doesn't just affect us, it affects those around us, of course. And then the haunting question that is not just our familial obligations, but societal obligations, where the question is, am I my brother's keeper? Yes, you are your brother and sister's keeper. So that's in Genesis 4. Genesis 5 is one you'd probably skip over. Genesis 5 has a long genealogy. We'll look at that and what that means, that genealogy. We'll also look at Genesis 11 or 10, because Genesis 10 also has a genealogy. And there are some fascinating things to learn from the numbers of years lived in Genesis 5 and a number of years lived in Genesis 10. The effects of sin become very real in people's lives. So the genealogy in 5 and 10, in between there is the story of Noah and the flood. And we're not going to take all kinds of time to look at the actual two strands of the story in Genesis 6 through 9 of Noah's flood, whether it's 2 of every kind or 7 of every kind. There are different uses of God's name in those, which tell us which time in which those stories were written. And then, as I said in the first episode, when the Pentateuch was edited and compiled, they put those stories, the 2 interweaving stories, and when you really look at Genesis 6 through 9, you can see, oh, here's one, here's another, repeating itself. So it's a fascinating way in which 6 through 9 are edited and compiled. Genesis 11 is a story of the Tower of Babel. They built a tower up into the heavens. God saw that. They wanted to be God, kind of like repeating the Garden of Eden, sin, wanting to be God. God destroys the Tower of Babel, the languages that were created and all of that, coming out of that sin of the people trying to be God. It's a far-ranging effect. Genesis 1 through 11, creation, fall, Cain and Abel, genealogy, Noah, another genealogy, Tower of Babel, and Genesis 1 through 11. That's called the prehistory. Prehistory, fitting into a certain type of biblical literature that is before Genesis 12, when the biblical history actually begins with the call of Abraham. We'll talk about Abraham's father and how he came from a pagan family. His father was an idol maker, and yet God called Abraham. God said to Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, I'm going to bless you, and all of your descendants will be the multitudinous as the stars in the sky or as the sand on the seashore. God gives Abraham what we call the Abrahamic covenant, how God is initiating God's plan of salvation through Abraham. The covenant that God will bless him outlines God's initial plan of salvation for how God now is going to be specific through the lineage of Abraham to save the world. The story of Abraham is in Genesis 12 through 25. 12 through 25, wandering, eventually having a son, Isaac, and then God calls Abraham to sacrifice Isaac on the Mount of Moriah in Genesis 22. A difficult story, but we'll spend some time unpacking that story also. That's Genesis 12 through 25. Genesis 25 through 28 is the story of Isaac, the son of Abraham and Sarah. God had a hand on Isaac's destiny Remember the sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22. Now, Isaac sowed the land, reaped a hundredfold, and we'll see some of the spiritual principles that come in that story of Isaac in 25 through 28. Genesis 28 through 36 is the story of Jacob. Jacob and Esau, we'll look at that story, of course, the twins. Jacob was a liar, he was a cheater. He was a guy who eventually found God, even though he tried to live life his own way. He ran from God. Jacob wrestled with God. Remember the story of Jacob wrestling with an angel? The ladder that came down from heaven, the angels ascending and descending. We'll look, of course, at that story. Jacob's name was eventually changed to Israel when he had 12 sons, a nation of Israel from Jacob's 12 sons. His name was changed to Israel. He had the 12 sons with 2 wives and 2 slaves, concubines, eventually ending up with 12 sons. We'll look at that specific story, and you'll start to shake your head. How does all that happen fit into God's larger plan as we look at those stories? Finally, Genesis 30 through 7 is a story of Joseph. Joseph redeems all of the messed up family systems in the prior chapter. Joseph was the guy at the end of Genesis who remained faithful to God's calling. Jacob had a tough life. He was the favored son. He was thrown in a pit. He was thrown in a pit. He was sold into slavery. He was accused of abuse. There's all kinds of stuff. Nonetheless, Joseph rose to the second in command of all of Egypt. That's why the Bible being written on 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. He's down in Egypt, thrown in a pit. His brothers came down to get grain, and the whole story of Joseph ends in a wonderful story of how God is able to redeem even our biggest mistakes. So, as we end this episode, I encourage you again to, when you get up in the morning, just say, it's going to be a great day. Say that a couple of times, even though there might be difficulties that come in, it's going to be a great day. And then also at the end of the day, look for 3 things for which you were grateful. So, here ends the episode, and make it a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.